Megan Stone is now at the Council on Foreign Relations, but for a long time she ran Malala's Fund, and she's deeply involved with that. All kinds of global advocacy and UN-related very positive work for a long time. But she's now, as you'll hear, a real student of what's happening with social media, particularly around women's issues and the issues of refugees, which all are among many issues that get wrapped into this discussion about the role of social media. Roger McNamee, I first met when we were both regulars on a show called Digital Jam about 20 years ago when CNN FN existed. And the thing is, Roger would go on that show, and they would basically just throw any tech company name at him, and he would say something intelligent about it with no prep. And it was amazing. It was like magical.
Live Q&A.
He has always been among the most knowledgeable people about the tech industry. But then he spent 35 years, that was in the middle of it, as an investor in tech. Then he was very involved in introducing Sheryl to Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and he was an investor in Facebook and made a lot of money in that, among his many investments. But now he has a book about to come out called Zucked, The Education of an Unlikely Activist, which he'll tell us a little bit about, I think. So I wanted to just start by reading the last sentence of the description of this session. Given all that we know about their influence, how should social media companies behave differently? Well, that is a very loaded sentence. Partly because what we know about their influence is so multifaceted, so complicated, so, in many cases, overwhelmingly negative, that what they should do is a very complicated question, although both of these two have some very good ideas about that. I happen to have, it's not just the two of them who know a lot about it. I wrote a book about Facebook called The Facebook Effect, so I have opinions that might creep out in the moderation here. But the thing, when you talk about social media, the main companies to talk about in the English-speaking world, in the non-Chinese world, are Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, I would say. But let's face it, Facebook overwhelmingly dominates global social media. And I want to just give you a few statistics or ideas to keep in mind as we have this discussion, because there's never been a company with this kind of scope and scale and global influence. It has about 2.25 billion users globally. That's about a third of the planet, close to a third of the planet. It is the most profitable large company that has ever existed, whose numbers we ever had any visibility into anyway. Its net margins have approached 45% after tax. And this year, its profits will be over 20 billion. And that's a company that, as recently as when it went public, I just saw an article yesterday that mentioned its profits at its IPO in 2012 were 60 million for the year. This year, it's going to make 20 billion. So that's the trajectory it's been on, even as it's been prioritizing growth and growing into literally every country on the planet. Even in North Korea, their government officials who use it. So it's a bizarre phenomenon that a company would have that kind of global footprint and have also become what is effectively the town square for every one of the countries in which it operates. That's just a background fact to keep in mind. So the question we're here to discuss, as I read before, is what should these companies do differently? So maybe I should just start by asking each of you to summarize what you think what should social media companies, and Facebook in particular, do differently. We will come to YouTube a little later because it's worth discussing, but why don't you start, Megan? What should Facebook do differently?
Yeah. I think this is the question that we're seeing right now at the center of so much needed public debate, and the stats that you shared frame everything, right? So when we're looking at a platform that about 30%, based on their recent Q2 FY18 numbers that they released, 30% of people in the entire world are on monthly and 20% are on daily. You really are the global public square. And I think we have to start asking questions about at what point is this analogous to being a nation state, being a global economy, and what kind of regulation, what kind of contemplation of what the relationship needs to be between that platform and a global community country by country, issue by issue, do we really need to look at and evaluate? And I think we have a lot of tools, and I think we're at the very beginning of starting to explore them. But I think anybody that's surprised that we're now in this corrective period wasn't paying attention. And I think we've seen this coming, and now it's really the job, I think, of journalists, of legislators, of the companies themselves, and of people like us in this room to really find the best way forward, not because there's a good guy or a bad guy, but because this is the society we're creating together, and we need to face this challenge and face it well. And so we need to find good solutions, and we need to find collaborative solutions.
But okay, that's a general statement. Do you want to go more specifically about what path you would most hope to see that go?
Yeah. Well, I think starting in the area that's easiest to control, moving outwards, I mean, initially, companies have got to continue to iterate on their terms of service and then enforce them. They have to enforce them. You know, I think we saw Alex Jones, you know, this alt-right commentator, was suspended for a week from Twitter last week. I checked on my phone before I came out. He's back on. But he was violating the Twitter terms, you know, quite flagrantly for quite a long time. And this wasn't someone that no one had heard about or wasn't sure what they were up to. You know, this was somebody that had a huge public platform for a very long time, doing things like saying that the parents of children who were killed in school shootings had made up these stories, you know, attacking these families. So, you know, these are pretty egregious acts. So I think companies, number one, need to start enforcing their own policies. That's an easy thing, and that's something that they could just decide to do. There are some things in these complex problems that are really hard, that are dependent upon external actors, and there are things that you could just decide to do. And so I think we need to keep up pressure on companies to decide to enforce what they already have in place. I think alongside that, when they fail that, we need to support journalists who are kind of our modern day muckrakers, who are out saying, wait a minute, you're not even enforcing your own rules. And I think we've seen some really good work from different journalists calling out companies, I think in a way that's healthy, and they're serving their appropriate role. Again, it's not about a bad guy or a good guy, it's about the fourth estate doing what they're supposed to do, right? Moving beyond that, regulation. I know nobody wants to talk about that in the Bay Area, but we're not in the same space we were 10 years ago with these companies. It is appropriate for regulation. You know, I think about these platforms like having a car, right? I can take my car and I can drive you to the hospital and save your life. I can take that car and I can have a business or bring you something that you really need to create the life you want for your community, or I can drive that car into a crowd in an act of terror. Cars are regulated. I have to get a license. If I break the law, there's a price to pay. I might get tickets or points on my license. I might get my license taken away. You know, we have to start thinking about ways to regulate that are thoughtful. And right now, I think we're at the very beginning of that process. But it's a healthy process, it's a needed process.
Okay, that's a good start. Roger, what would you add to that or disagree with?
So I would tell you that I think there are four separate areas that we have to look at. There's the whole issue of democracy and election security. There is the issue of public health, just the effect on people's minds, particularly children. There is privacy. And then lastly, the impact that monopoly has on entrepreneurship and innovation. So the four categories all come from a common root, which is the business model, the attention economy that dominates social media. And you need to essentially do one of two things. You either need to change the business model, or you need to have lots and lots of heavyweight regulation for each of the four failure modes that are going on now. If I were in the board of Facebook, I would beg the management team, as I have already done with the management team at Google, to recognize that we've entered a new world, and they're on both the wrong side of history and, unfortunately, the wrong side of regulation. Just if you look at the EU alone, Google is going to lose every case it has in the EU because the business practices of the company, as the business practices are true at Facebook, violate EU rules. I mean, they now have a thing called the General Data Protection Regulation, and both companies are in massive daily violation of it, plus they're in violation of the EU's rules on monopoly behavior. And to the extent that they can prove a tie of Facebook or any of the other platforms to the outcome on Brexit, they have another whole set of issues there. And so I would advise them to recognize that they need to start moving pronto. The advice I gave them both early on was embrace GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, as a religion. Treat it like, the reason is because the costs of compliance are fixed. And so the larger you are, the smaller it is as a proportion of your sales. And if Google had done that right off the bat, they would have gotten in a different lifeboat from Facebook and would have been for them, probably all the other issues would have melted away. But the fact that both of them have chosen to defy the European Union is setting up a long and brutal process, and they're not going to win. So the key thing to remember is that regulation is not designed to make things right. Regulation is designed to change behavior. And you go from small aperture to large aperture. So think of it as you go from a small hammer up to a mallet. And the GDPR was a very small thing. It would have had almost no impact on the underlying business model of those companies. And having failed to embrace that, the next wave of things are going to start to be ever larger, more damaging things. And the goal here is not to get to good outcomes through regulation. It is to stop these guys, to change their behavior. And there's only one way this winds up, and they got to get with the program, and they haven't figured that out yet.
The only way it winds up is with a more responsible landscape for public speech on digital platforms.
I think there's a whole bunch of things besides public speech they got to get.
Well, yeah, but a lot of things flow from that. The consequences of how people act on these platforms.
No, that's right. But the whole attention economy also has all these addiction issues, which relative to children are going to create generations of problems if we don't nip them in the bud. And it all comes down to this notion that we've moved away from technology as a bicycle for our minds, right? The Steve Jobs adage, the thing that the Valley was really, that Licklider and the others who originally envisioned the personal computer, they viewed it as a way to make us more capable. And now we're on this notion of artificial intelligence, which is literally about stripping us of the things that make us individuals, right? I mean, right down to Alexa, where, it's gonna do your music for you. And it's like, you must be kidding. And my point is, we as a Valley, the great opportunity for everybody in this room is to declare that human-driven technology is the next big thing. We're going back to bicycle for the mind, and then just do it. It's a huge opportunity. We can do it in every one of the 4 categories I described and be wildly better off.
Roger, let me ask you if this is a way of reinterpreting what you just said. That so long as AI is being deployed primarily to assist in the provisioning of advertising and marketing to individuals whose attention is the source of profitability for these companies, we are headed in the wrong direction, in effect.
That's for certain true, but I would argue that the same basic notion, essentially the model that people are bringing to AI has some intellectual flaws in it because we start with a set of things that just aren't true, like this notion that technology is value neutral, right? The reason why Google's facial recognition had trouble with people of color is because it's not value neutral. It's not even close. Technology always is imbued with the values of the people who create it. That's part of why it was so great for so long, because the values of the people who created it were great. And also, for a long time, technology limitations prevented us from doing harm. Really, it wasn't until about 2003 that we had enough processing power, storage, memory, and bandwidth to actually hurt anybody, right? So we were protected from ourselves. But when the change took place, we didn't adjust our value system to reflect that there were things we could now do with technology that maybe we shouldn't have done.
Yeah. I would add to that, it's not just the values of who was on those teams, it was the very people who were or were not on those teams. I just saw coming here today from the airport, Joe Gebbia from Airbnb had shared in a tweet about a recent study out of Wired that 11% of AI researchers are women, only 11%.
Right.
Of course that's going to shape. So I think what you said is really meaningful about values, but even then there was a problem. I think we need to say in rooms like this that women, people of color, and then global diversity, not just American diversity, but global diversity, was not represented on these teams. And so, I think we need to be careful saying that was a heyday or safer or better.
No, I'm saying the technology, I'm totally with you, because I look at this and diversity is an inherently good thing in all products because the world is highly diverse. And so the notion with women as 51% of the population, 80% of purchase decisions, that they're not the right people to be making marketing decisions about new consumer-oriented products, that's nuts. Of course you want them to.
Yeah.
And so, I just think as a tech industry, we have a lot of opportunity right now to change the subject. And in a sense, I think this is less about what Facebook and Twitter and Google do and more about what the rest of us do. How do we organize our time? Do we play the game on their rules, on their field, Or do we change the subject, as this valley has done repeatedly for 75 years? I'm just arguing it's time to change the subject.
Is that change of subject something that is left to the consumer and the end user to do, or is entrepreneurial innovation going to help with that from people who are reflecting a different set of values?
The entrepreneurs have always had a leadership role in this, maybe not the only leadership role, but a leadership role.
Okay.
And I mean, again, I'm saying what's wrong right now is a huge opportunity for all entrepreneurs.
You know what's interesting? This is such a multifaceted subject that we're going in a completely different direction than I thought we would, but it's great. I want to go to you in this something specific that you and I have discussed, but before that, I wanted to add one more statistic on the non-diversity issue that came out recently, which is a different part of the industry, but we have to really face all of these things. The stat that was just a couple weeks ago that 40% of all venture capitalists in the United States went to either Stanford or Harvard. I mean, you want to talk about non-diversity, give me a break. That is just crazy, and look, those are good schools, but that doesn't make any sense at all except the perpetuation of an elite. Okay, so the thing I wanted to ask you about was Myanmar, which you are really an expert in, and what's happened there because of social media.
Yeah.
I think you should quickly walk us through that so people here get a sense of the issues that have to be addressed.
Yeah, I think these are instructive cases that the sector just needs to stop, take a breath, and say, okay, what has happened here in terms of unintended use cases or consequences of technology that gets developed? And I think this gets to the inclusiveness, and again, global, not just American diversity, but global true diversity, which is a way broader picture about how is this technology going to be used. So, last year, is actually a year ago, August 2017 started what many call a genocide, right? What happened in Myanmar or Burma is that an ethnic minority of Muslim population, the Rohingya, had rape, horrendous persecution, and 700,000 people fled, many of them to Bangladesh. The UN had an independent report, an analysis of this that came out, and they said that Facebook played a determining role. How did Facebook play a role in a genocide? That doesn't seem like it could possibly connect. People were spreading hate speech on the platform in ways that were really clear and really able to be addressed. And you might say, wait a minute, how could somebody in Menlo Park possibly have any idea how to push back on something like this or what was going on? And I think this gets to the heart of the challenge, is that we can't do business in countries and change the fabric of how people communicate without a level of responsibility in how we build teams, right? So what happened in this particular country is that way back in I say way back, it was only a few years ago, 2010, 2011, internet penetration in Myanmar was less than 1%. Less than 1% of people are online because of state control, because of the repressive government and regime there. So they start to loosen up some of the rules and regulations. They start to let people in. So today we're at 90% of mobile access in the country. So huge change in a short amount of time. Before, newspapers were controlled by the state. Now you have Facebook out. They did a research study recently last year. 75% of people are on Facebook in Myanmar or Burma. And of them, I think close to 60% said that they believe that anything that's on Facebook is probably true and trustworthy. So these are crazy high numbers.
Media literacy is not their forte.
Hang on.
Yeah,
let me put that in context. So I believe it was 3 years ago, wireless penetration was 3%. It's now 70 some odd percent, plus many people have multiple people to a phone, so that's how you get to 90. Before that, there was no public square in Myanmar. There was no national media, there were no national newspapers, there was no national telecommunications infrastructure. So they literally went from the media equivalent of nothing to Facebook without anything in between. So they had no ability to develop the filters that experience would give you. That's the context in which
Okay,
this
but
happened. And Médecins Sans Frontières says, as of December, 9,000 confirmed dead, 42,000 missing and presumed dead. And again, the UN said that Facebook enabled, quote, a textbook ethnic cleansing, unquote.
Yeah.
And they uniquely did it. There are no other internet platforms.
And if I
This
just
is
would chime in,
free
one of the
basics.
things, the government was very much contributing, the anti-Muslim.
Well, the guy was the principal Buddhist ally of the government.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but
lead guy.
continue with what happened.
Yeah. So I think this shouldn't be surprising anybody that looks at genocide. When you look at what happened in Rwanda, radio played this role, right? Of course, communication platforms, old school and new school, all play a role in this. And the challenge is that there were smoke signals about that this was coming way before. So in 2012, there was a case where there were riots that were triggered by content that was on Facebook specifically, cause and effect, right? 2013, 2014, activists in the country were meeting with really senior officials at Facebook saying there's a problem here and you need to attend to it. There was nobody working on Burmese language content on the platform. At one point,
Nobody.
At
There
one
was
point,
no company expert who spoke the language.
I think until 2014 or 15, they had one person, right? So fast forward, a genocide has happened, an independent UN body has said that Facebook had a role to play in this. You know, we all saw the testimony. I think it was a high water mark for Senate testimony when Mark Zuckerberg testified on the Hill. I don't know if as many people have ever watched testimony in recent times, but if you go back and look at it, he was actually specifically asked about this from Senator Leahy, about this, what happened and what will change, right? So
In Myanmar, yeah.
In Myanmar. So there were a lot of good answers given at that time. You know, he said this was terrible and that they were looking at it. You know, all the right things were said. There was a report that just came out last week from Reuters working together with some academics looking at what's changed. Okay, so what's changed? We've had a year since this incredibly tragic instance, this terrible genocide has happened. They found that to this day, guess how many employees Facebook has in Myanmar? Anybody want to guess? Shout out an answer. You gave away my answer.
Roger is answering.
Roger cheated. It's 0. The answer is 0.
After all that, they
Zero.
they have not flooded the zone.
Yeah,
They have
it's
no-
0. And today, the way that they're monitoring hate speech content is actually in a separate country. It's in Kuala Lumpur, and it's a group of 60 people who are subcontracted through Accenture. So, you know, this isn't, again, about, like, I don't think it's helpful to create change by casting people as good guys or bad guys, right? This is highly imperfect. And I do think there are a lot of sincere people at Facebook who are trying to create ways to address this, but it's not moving fast enough.
Okay.
And I think they're too good not to get this right. They can do better.
We're racing through our time. I'm going to briefly step out of my moderator role and comment, add something, since I've been watching Facebook closely since 2006. My book, which came out in 2010, was perceived to be a sort of apologia, a celebration of Facebook in many ways, and in many ways it was. I have become appalled by the consequences of the emphasis on growth, because in effect, Facebook prioritized growth among all things in all geographies, even though the company knew that the nature of the newsfeed was that fear and anger were essentially amplified because they generate more attention. But they still went into every country with no local language expertise and no cultural expertise and felt that was a perfectly fine thing to do. And as a result, we have seen it deeply documented in Myanmar. This is not even close to the only country. It's been well documented in Sri Lanka also, but it is happening in scores of countries, probably over 100 countries. And in fact, you know, what we saw in the US with Russian manipulation, Russia is also manipulating electoral activity in scores of countries using Facebook. You know, my own personal opinion is when you look at another thing that's happening in the world, which is this extraordinary rise in demagogues, you know, Orban in Hungary, demagogic governments now in Poland, Slovenia, Austria, and look at Turkey, and these are countries where, you know, generally we thought, oh, they were kind of going in a good direction. Is it just sheer coincidence that this has happened at the same time that this global system of communications has gone off track? I don't think so, but it can't be proven. In any case, I wanted to say that that is the scariest thing to me about the whole thing. So let's go to the basic theme, though. What should we do? Let's go deeper into that. You know, one of the things that was discussed recently was a sort of citizens' Congress. There was an op-ed that advocated for that the other day. You know, because you know you're both sort of advocates of government doing something, right? But there's not a good track record of government doing effective things on technology at speed.
I think it's on us to educate lawmakers, and like God help any of us that went to the Hill and talked about net neutrality. You know, that's like pushing a boulder up the hill, but like it's on us to do that. We've got to do it, and there is a track record of change happening. You know, it's not by happenstance that workers have some modicum of workplace safety and rights now. It's because workers were mistreated. There were some culminating incidents. You know, we were talking about some of the moments in history where there was a breakthrough moment and people unionized and they fought and they got laws passed and now we enforce them perfectly. No, but it's a tool. It's a tool, and I think we're there. I think the Wild West days are over in terms of we're just going to see what happens when we release this technology out into the wild, and we're assuming because we feel like we're good people, everyone else is going to use it well. We're not there. We're not there anymore, and I think regulation has a healthy, appropriate role
But there's
to play.
no movement toward regulation at the macro scale right now.
I think there
No,
is.
no,
Yeah, I think there
David,
definitely
I
is.
think you're looking too parochially.
Okay, go
you
on.
You have to look at Europe and recognize that Europe is 230 million or
Europe
whatever
is
it is.
leading the way, there's no doubt.
And they're taking the lead. So I think antitrust law is the most pro-growth form of regulatory intervention you can have. And we all are here because the AT&T 1956 consent decree took the transistor and put it in the public domain. And there has never been a technology antitrust action that didn't leave both the industry and the target company better off than they were before. So, and shareholders.
That's
by
a
the way.
strong statement, but
Well, I go
rest
back
you
and
may.
I've
Okay.
actually studied it very
Keep going.
closely, and
No, you've
take a
studied
look
it.
at IBM, Microsoft, and the components of AT&T. The math is the math,
Yeah.
and so my view is you start there, but you also have the mallet of the other stuff to encourage them to do the right thing, and I look at this and I think, frankly, the most important thing is for all of us to recognize that there are failure modes here, not because these are bad people, but because some things we took for granted, things like the thin startup model, right, turned out to have limits, and we didn't recognize those limits in time, in these cases, to do something about them. You cannot take an MVP model and run it up to global thing with 2 billion users. You have to have strategy, you have to plan, you have to think about failure modes in advance, and so, because breaking things is not acceptable at that scale. And so I look at this and I go, I don't know if we can fix these guys, to be totally honest with you, but I know we can innovate around them. And it's really obvious. I mean, we go back to the edge, away from everything in the cloud. You look at the model that Apple's done relative to the facial recognition, the iPhone 10, you realize you want privacy to be about data staying at the edge, not going centrally. You want to have things that protect consumers even if they don't know they need to be protected. Those are business opportunities, okay? And if anybody wants to talk about it, contact me, because it's like this stuff, there's real opportunities around here. I don't know, these guys aren't hearing the message that the market is giving them right now. And so I'm worried about their ability to change.
You mean, we say these guys, are you meaning Facebook or beyond? You mean
I mean,
YouTube
Facebook,
as well?
Yeah, YouTube and Twitter.
All
And-
three?
All three. And, I spent 3 months trying to get Cheryl Mark to look at this on the basic notion that if there was something wrong, they needed to know before it was public. And if there wasn't anything wrong, it wasn't going to cost anything to look. But they felt like, nah, not a problem.
That's partly what made you feel you had to write a book, was that whole chain of
Yeah.
events.
Well, what made me write the book
I mean, the thing
is,
you have to remember, Roger really was close to Mark and Cheryl for a long time.
I don't know. I mean, in the larger scheme of things, I was somebody who, for brief moments of time, was important to them, but
Yeah.
never really emotionally close.
Fair enough.
What I would say, though, that is true, though, is that I did play a role a couple times, and the thing I would say is that I was a total fan. Right? I was a promoter and supporter of it. And I was shocked. I was convinced in 2016, before the election, when I reached out to them, that they were the victim. What I hadn't realized was the degree to which their business practices and their business model had contributed to the problem, and to which, and then the embedded employees in the Trump campaign had actually contributed to the outcome of the election.
Not to mention the Russians, but yeah.
Fair point. But so I look at all these things and I just go, I think it's hard to be them right now, and I'm really sympathetic, and I understand, why it's hard for the employees to rise up. But I sit there and go, guys, look at Myanmar. That's not okay.
Okay, wait.
And,
No, but we're very short on time. I wanted to get to more YouTube stuff, but the reality is Facebook, just to keep on them, is devoting enormous resources to the point that in their last quarter, I mean, Mark's been saying for a year or so, hey, our profits will be affected, in the last quarter they said, our rate of growth is slowing significantly and our rate of profitability is going to go down, period, end of story, because of the efforts we are taking. Does that encourage you? And I mean, I'd like,
I think what we're seeing is the kind of sleeping giant starting to wake up. Like, are we there yet? No, but I think the system that is, by the way, always the case in activism, right? There's no incentivization for any company to make these more value-based moral decisions. Sometimes some companies are better than others because of leadership or because how they're formed, but there's always a system of healthy pressures between the press, between consumers, between lawmakers, between people who've been harmed, people that see a better way that need to come together. I think we also need to be careful not to have an absolutist kind of argument. It used to be everything that comes out of the Bay Area is perfect and it's going to change the world and be amazing. And now it's like, well, everything's bad about social platforms. And that's not true. And I think a positive example is the Me Too movement that was powered by these social platforms and women that had absolutely no ability to communicate inexpensively, publicly, and find each other, not just in the United States, but globally, have been able to have incredible wins and successes and be visible for the first time. And so I think it's wrong for us to put, I think we need to get out of this dichotomy. It's a gray area, right?
Yeah.
Just like, guess what? Just like all of us, just like people.
Well,
We shouldn't be surprised when human behavior starts happening in spaces where humans gather. It's gonna happen, and so we need to get in front of it and own it.
Well, yeah, and Roger doesn't agree with me. I still believe, despite everything that has been said up here and that I've said, that because of its many-fold social impact on people's lives, Facebook probably is still a net positive in the world. So, it's a complicated thing, but I will say, as a business journalist for 30-some years, Roger's an investor for 35 years, I think he would agree with me. There's probably no case that either one of us, and Megan's not a business executive person, but she's a longtime observer of things from a more government and public policy.
You're mansplaining me.
I'm mansplaining. Yeah, I did that before, sorry. So, but what I was going to say, I was just trying to say, I didn't want to leave you out, okay?
Thanks.
The point is, I don't think you could find... Let me finish the point. I get it. Okay, fine.
We're friends.
We are friends. But I don't think you could find a company that has had two such strong advocates publicly turn to such strong critics as both Roger and I have become in any industry that I've ever seen. I mean, there's so many things about this situation that are absolutely unprecedented, and it's because of the nature of this technology and its impact on our lives now.
It's the most disappointing, saddest, frustrating, emotionally damaging thing I've ever seen. And all I would say to you guys is just protect your children, okay?
Well, even Sean Parker says that.
Yeah, protect your children.
We've got to wrap, unfortunately. Thank you, and thank you to two fantastic panelists.
Thank you.
Including you. Of course.